Good morning, or good afternoon, rather, everybody. Welcome to all of you to this webinar. I'm Gauthier, Director of the GGP, and I'm joined today by my team. We're located in the Netherlands at the NIDI, the Netherlands Interdisciplinary Demographic Institute. There are more than 100 of you joining us today on this seminar from all around the world, so welcome. There are two acronyms that we'll often be using today. The GGP, which refers to our research infrastructure based in the Netherlands, and the GGS, which is the survey that we have run in close to 20 countries in the past decade. So to start, let me just say a few words about the GGP. It's a research infrastructure focused on population and family dynamics, which aims at better understanding people's life course trajectories, especially in regard to fertility decisions, family formation and dissolution, and issues such as work-life balance. We're the only social science global infrastructure which covers the whole life course from the transition to adulthood till retirement and older ages. And although our key focus is on demographic events, such as leaving parental home, forming a family, or becoming a grandparent, we also view these events from a broader contextual perspective, taking into account the characteristics of the country. And of course, as our name indicates, we also pay a special attention to the relationship between men and women and between generations. Our data are open access to scientific users, and we count more than 4,000 users worldwide. Now, our first GGS, Generation and Gender Survey, was carried out 15 years ago, or even more so. Since then, the world has changed a lot. On the one hand, more countries have reached low levels of fertility, families and life trajectories have become even more complex, and there has been a trend, at least in some countries, towards more gender equality. On the other hand, new technologies and new developments have actually totally changed the field of survey methodology. For these two reasons, changing demography and survey developments, we are now planning a new round of data collection in 2020. The aim of this seminar today is therefore to discuss our plan with you for this new round of data collection, to allow you to ask questions and to provide information as to how to participate in the GGP. And of course, if you have questions after this webinar, you should not hesitate to contact us via email. This contact information will be provided at the end of today. So now let me introduce you to Dr. Tom Emery, our program manager, who will be taking you through this webinar.
Thank you, Anne. So I'm going to be talking you through today a few bits of the GGP, as Anne mentioned. So I'm going to start out by talking about how we did things last time in the previous round of data collection, and then talking about how it's going to be a bit different in this new round of data collection that we're going to be doing in 2020. And then I'll go on to some details about the specific timetable that we have put in place to ensure that enough countries can participate in this new round of data collection. Then we'll move on to some frequently asked questions that we get from national teams about how to implement the GGP. And then Deirdre will finish up by talking about exactly how you can get involved. So that's enough of the introductions, and now we can actually move on to our presentation. So in the previous round of data collection, as Anne said, this took place nearly 15 years ago, started in 2004, and was conducted in 19 countries from across the world. And 13 of these countries actually managed to do longitudinal data collection. So it was a relatively big success, and this resulted in a large number of publications, including dissertations, master's theses, and working papers, book chapters, and published articles. And as Anne mentioned, we have now 4,000 users worldwide who download the data from our website, along with all the other data that we have on offer at the GGP. So the previous round was considered a huge success. However, there were some challenges that we encountered in the previous round. And as Anne mentioned, the situation has changed now, and we're hoping that this new round of data collection can really meet those challenges. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So why would we do this whole endeavour again? The coordination capacity of our central hub at NIDI has increased quite dramatically, especially because of technology. In the survey technologies that are now available to us enable us to do cross-national surveys from a central hub and coordinate in a very highly sophisticated way. And this has been implemented in a wide number of surveys across the social sciences. Multi-mode is also more feasible. In 2004, we didn't even have smartphones, and now most surveys actually have to adapt to this new environment where surveys can be filled in on the phone. There's increasingly feasible for administrative data linkage. It's something that governments are increasingly looking to support, and it offers increasing opportunities for new areas of science to be explored. The data is, as Anne mentioned, also quite out of date. It's 15 years old now, and a huge amount has happened throughout the world over the last 15 years that we believe will have changed family dynamics and some of the topics that the GGP is interested in. We've had a very large recession, a recovery, and huge changes in migration patterns in that time, and these will have impacted quite greatly family dynamics all over the world. We also, at the central component of the GGP is that there should be a strong empirical base for public debate. We produce our data so that we can conduct high quality research that then informs policy. So this is a central important point of why we want to do a new round of data collection. So how are we going to do this in the new round? And how are we going to take on some of the challenges that we faced in the previous round of data collection? So the previous round was really decentralized. Each national team was relatively independent and able to conduct the survey by themselves. They would also predominantly conduct the survey by paper and pencil, or what's called PAPI. Very few countries actually conducted the survey on tablets. This made processing of the data very slow, cumbersome, and led to a large amount of deviations across countries. In this new round of data collection, we're going to be centralizing a lot of these activities. So NIDI will be playing a far greater supportive role in fielding the survey, and we'll be conducting the survey exclusively on CAPI, so computer-assisted personal interviews, or on COWI, which are computer-assisted web interviews. So the survey will actually be conducted without interviewers in some contexts. This allows for a kind of multi-mode approach to the survey implementation and the possibility that the survey can be actually conducted on phones, on tablets, and all the many new devices that people have. So with all these challenges, the central hub will be able to address many of the issues that were raised in the previous round of data collection. This centralization is based on some of the latest technology in survey research. So the survey itself will run on Blaze, a survey software, which allows us to coordinate the surveys cross-nationally, manage translations, and collect very detailed paradata about how the survey is progressing in each country as the data is collected. The data will be documented and processed using the Data Documentation Initiative framework, the DDI framework, which ensures that the data is sustainably archived and of the optimal use for scientists in the field. And we will also be using Nestar to ensure that data is then available and accessible to researchers everywhere. We'll also be integrating technologies from other survey research infrastructures. For example, we'll be using what's called the translation management tool that's been developed by Share to ensure that translations are done by national teams to the highest possible quality, and that we can actually work with national teams to ensure that the national interpretation of the core questionnaire is optimized both for the scientists and for also fitting to national context. So we're using the latest technologies in survey research to ensure the highest level of quality and coordination in the survey. So what does all this mean for the interaction between the central hub here at NIDI and national teams, such as potentially yourselves? So what we would do in the previous round of data collection is simply provide a core questionnaire to national teams. Then it was up to the national teams to code that questionnaire, build that questionnaire, collect the data, process the data, and send it back to NIDI. And this would take a very long time, and it put a lot of pressure on national teams. What we're keen to do now is have a highly iterative interaction with the national teams and support them throughout the fieldwork process. So first of all, we provide you with the core questionnaire and fieldwork guidelines to conduct the study. That's step one. The translation is then provided back by national teams using the TNT to the central hub. And together we work to make sure that the survey is optimized for that national context. So all the questions are adapted to the national context in the best possible way for research. Then once that translation is complete, we actually provide the CAPI, the coded questionnaire, for field workers to deploy in the field straight away. This means that in every country, exactly the same questionnaire is fielded. What that central instrument also means then that data comes back and is transmitted from the doorstep in the country that's participating right to NIDI. And we can then support national teams in evaluating the fieldwork as it is going. What we then do is provide feedback to the national teams on a very regular basis and identifying issues as they arise. So, for example, in some of the fieldwork we've been conducting so far using this model, we were able to identify interviewers who were not quite following the guidelines exactly, so that they weren't having the interview in a one-on-one situation, for example, or they were taking a long time to complete interviews. So now we can catch those issues before they become too prominent and address them in the field. Then the data, as I mentioned, is transferred back to NIDI, and we do the majority of the processing work on that data. So we provide a significant amount of data processing and support to national teams as the data is being collected and once the data is collected. And this results in a final file and report being provided to national teams very soon after the fieldwork is completed. We recently completed fieldwork in Belarus, and 3 days after the fieldwork was completed, we provided a national team report and made the data available to researchers across the world. This is a very, very fast way of conducting surveys and ensuring that data is made available to researchers and to policymakers as soon as possible after fieldwork has ended. So we're going to take a brief pause now and ask if you have any questions. And particularly, we're also going to ask you a question. And the question we are going to ask you, because just to get a sense of who we have in our audience today, is, have you ever used GGP data before? And we also have, you should also be able to make, ask questions yourself in the chat box, which I believe should be.
And now back to Daniela.
Yeah, back to Daniela.
Hey, I'm back. Thank you, Tom, very much for this interesting presentation so far. Now it's time for all participants to type the questions you may have. You can do this in the chat window in the upper right corner, as you can see. Please ask whatever you would like to know. I will then pick some questions and read them out so that everyone can follow. So to start with some questions, I have one for you, Tom. Why only 13 countries did the wave 2?
So that's a really good question. It's a question we're often asked. The longitudinal data collection was particularly difficult in the last round. If you look at the dates of when the second wave of data collection was, in Europe in particular, it was exactly around the time of the recession and where science budgets were being cut. So it hit the GGP hard. It's also been very difficult for national teams to raise money for the longitudinal data collection. In this new round of data collection, we're going to be much more supportive of national teams to try and ensure that the data collection is not only carried out in wave 1, but sustainably as well through the waves over wave 2 and wave 3.
Okay, so I cannot see, I can see someone is typing a question, so let's wait a bit. So here we have the first one. Does it mean that countries must use face-to-face? Would phone work still work?
That question is coming in from Sweden. So within the new GGP, the primary aim is still to conduct face-to-face interviews, but we are allowing for a diversification in the modes and in a much more structured way than in the previous rounds of data collection. We aren't too supportive of use of CATI surveys, so interviews conducted by a telephone, but we will be enabling increasingly web interviews, which are a very good alternative to telephone interviews. So these COWI interviews, we're actually currently conducting a pilot on how best to implement these within a wide range and diverse range of countries at the moment, and we'll be reporting back on that by the end of the year. So this is something that we're really interested in supporting.
Okay, now let's go to a second question. What countries are participating in 2020 so far?
So we have a large number of countries that have expressed their interest in participating in the GGP. for 2020, and that list is growing on a fairly regular basis. Some of the countries that have already signed a statement of intent include Germany. We've had interest as well from East Asia, countries such as Taiwan and China, and even interest from Japan as well again. We've also had a quite significant interest from Latin America as well. So new regions of the world being interested in fielding the GGP. So not only the European countries who are traditionally fielding these surveys, but also from further afield.
Okay, now let's go to another one. Will you coordinate multiple requests to set up a national team from the same country?
A great question, and actually what we try to do with national teams is to build a national team that actually represents the entire research community in that country and ensure that there's maximum participation from the research community. So a broad range of stakeholders involved in data collection.
So, and what issues will be covered with respect to work-life balance?
I think that's a very good question. Do you want to field that one?
Sure. Well, with work-life balance, it has to be understood that the questionnaire builds on the previous one. We're going to make some changes, but we're maintaining some core issues. So what are some of the things we were interested in work-life balance? The issue of flexibility at work, the issue of support from the employer in combining work and family responsibility, the issue of work-family overlap in the sense, are you too tired to when you come to work because of family responsibility, or vice versa. So there's a whole range of issues related to work-life balance that a special section of the questionnaire is devoted to.
So I'll take the chance and skip directly to another similar question on the content. To what extent GGS integrates questions related to sexual and reproductive health and rights, including access to contraception, unmet need, and methods of contraception?
Thank you very much for this question. What we're doing with the GGP, and this is part of the modification that I was talking about, so we're trying to align them to the Sustainable Development Goals. So in capturing, being able to report therefore on contraceptive use, but indeed on unmet need, which we were not doing the last time round. So that will be very important, because we're at the stage here where countries are under pressure to report on these SDGs, and this is where the GGP hopes to make really help national teams.
Great. So another question: will India's data include in the GGP 2020?
In India that will be interested in participating in the GGP will be happy to explore opportunities, so they should get in touch with us.
Okay, there's another question. Our statistical agency does not currently use Blaze. Would we have to invest in that ourselves, or will GGS come packaged in Blaze and covered by our license agreements?
This is a great question. Blaze is a very expensive piece of software, and one of the advantages of having such a centrally coordinated software is that it is indeed covered by our central license, and that we help with the technical implementation of the questionnaire by interviewers in each country. So yes, it's covered by the GGP central office.
So another question: will the new survey include the same respondents from the 2004 survey, or will it be a new first wave?
These are completely fresh samples. This is not not the same respondents. This will be a new round of data collection.
And I think the rationale here is that we want everybody, especially since they're new countries, joining, and considering that there's been quite a long time since wave 2 or wave 3 in some countries. We want therefore everybody to start fresh at the same point, and therefore with fresh samples in each country.
Okay, so I'll take a final question now, and then you come back to your presentation. And then all the other questions that comes, I'll then collect them and you'll reply by email afterwards. So I'll pick a final question. In the 2004 round, there was the obligation that the National Statistical Institute to collect the data. Is there a similar request for 2020 round?
It's not an obligation in this round, but we strongly encourage it. Cooperation with the National Statistical Offices usually enables access to population registers, which provide better sampling frames, and they have a huge amount of experience and expertise in actually conducting fieldwork. However, we understand that every national context is different. National statistical offices have different levels of cooperation with researchers, and sometimes they're not particularly open to conducting fieldwork. So we understand in some contexts it's not always possible. In those situations, we're happy to work with researchers to look at alternative arrangements for fieldwork.
Okay, so let's go back to your presentation.
Okay.
I'll leave you for the moment.
Okay. So now we'll move on a little bit to the timetable that we have in mind and that we set out for the new round of data collection. So obviously with 2020, it might sound like a far distant date in the future, but it's only about 18 months away now. And so we need to start making preparations today. So we actually have received funding from the European Commission to begin preparations for this in a project which we're calling EPI, Evaluate, Plan, Initiate. And this is a 3-year project that's been running since last year. Last year, we conducted a lot of evaluation activities to explore how the data collection was done last year and look at how it can be improved for the next round. Now, in 2018, we started making plans and setting out exactly how the data collection will be done. In 2019, we begin a phase of initiation, so beginning the first steps of actually implementing the data collection. So I'm going to walk you through the steps over the next, say, 24 months from now until when we begin to plan to begin data collection in a wide range of countries. Before I do, though, it's good to note that we've actually started data collection in a few countries that we're using as a kind of test cases. And so far, the results have been very good. And it's been a very successful kind of start to the project. Last year, we conducted the GGP in Belarus, where they completed over 10,000 interviews with respondents from across the country. And this was done in a highly centralized framework. So we were able to monitor and assess fieldwork as it was being completed and ensure that the data quality was of the highest possible standard. And as I mentioned before, the data was released just 3 days after the final interview was conducted. What we're doing now, as we speak, data is being collected in Kazakhstan, where they're conducting over 15,000 interviews with respondents. The graph on the right there shows the actual progress of fieldwork as of just a few days ago. This is an exceptionally challenging environment, and it includes very diverse fieldwork conditions, working with nomadic populations and a wide variety of kind of languages and circumstances. The questionnaire is fielded in multiple languages, in both Kazakh and Russian, and they'll be using a sample management system. That means that the national team controls the sample, but that we can help and support them in monitoring response rates and actual interviewer workloads to ensure that the data is collected in the best possible way. In Latvia also, we'll be starting some data collection in June. This is going to be hopefully a very nice experiment, looking at how the new fieldwork model can be deployed in a country such as Latvia. The sample management system will also be provided here, and we'll be working with the team to ensure optimal kind of fieldwork conditions. And the questionnaire is also translated into Russian and Latvian, allowing the interviewers to switch during the survey between the two languages. So this is an interesting challenge for us to manage. Later this year, we'll also be conducting a small pilot in Argentina, in the city of Buenos Aires, with an experimental sample there. And this fieldwork will be conducted in late 2018. So we've got lots of interesting examples with a wide range of fieldwork conditions to be testing this new model under, so that hopefully when we come to this new phase of data collection in 2020, we have accumulated a large amount of experience and we're able to work in the diverse range of environments that the GGP includes. So what we'll be doing over the next few months before the end of 2018 is finalizing the full specifications for tendering, fieldwork, and the costing assessment to ensure that national teams are supported in their applications for funding and laying out their plans for data collection. We'll also be formalizing the fieldwork guidelines and, as Anne mentioned, completing any amendments to the questionnaire to ensure that they meet the needs of the research community. Then we'll also be conducting regional workshops across the world to ensure that the GGP is adapted to these regional contexts, as they differ quite substantially. So, for example, in Scandinavia, there's high uses of administrative data, And so the questionnaire will need to be adapted to integrate that administrative data linkage. We'll also be conducting one in Puebla, in Mexico, later this year to encourage and develop the growing GGP community that there is in Latin America. There'll also be one in Zagreb, in Croatia, later this year to meet the specific challenges of countries in Southern Europe looking to field the survey. Finally, there'll be one in Shanghai in July to support the growing GGP community in East Asia and the specific challenges that we encounter in conducting field work there. So we're trying to address the challenges of all these different regions individually and support the growing GGP communities there. In 2019, we'll be building off this planning work and actually providing the final questionnaire for translation by national teams via the translation management tool that I mentioned earlier. National teams will then be able to translate and back-translate the questionnaire, and we can work together with the central hub and the consortium board of the GGP to ensure that the translation is optimized and ready for the deployment in the field. The central coordination team will also work with the national teams to try and ensure sustainable funding for the project and identify particular funding streams to support their work. Hopefully, if all goes well, we'll be conducting pre-testing in countries from late 2019 with a target date for first data collection in early 2020. However, we have an extended fieldwork window by which the first wave of data collection can take place between 2020 and 2022. So these are the earliest dates at which you could start, not the latest. So in terms of the fieldwork procedures, the future GGP data collection will be coordinated very centrally. The sample management will actually be conducted within country, but with the support of the central hub. So that personal data, the private data that identifies individuals, will never be transferred directly to NIDI, but the survey responses will be. Sampling and fieldwork procedures will be entirely pre-harmonized to ensure that we don't have to do a lot of post-hoc harmonization, as was the case in previous rounds. You won't be able to remove questions from the questionnaire, and you have to fill the full GGP wave in its entirety, and questions can be added to fit national context. The fieldwork procedures have to be flexible, though, and we understand this. You work in a diverse range of environments, and the GGP can't just be deployed in a systematic way across all countries. This isn't realistic, and nor is it feasible. Some countries have very extensive population registers, for example, and we should be taking advantage of those. But not every country does, and in some countries, there is a much more challenging fieldwork environment to work with. So the GGP has always had a flexible model to engage with national teams, and this is something we're looking to continue. So we adapt to the diverse community that we represent. We recognize that fieldwork in the Netherlands is very different to fieldwork in Kazakhstan, and this is something that we have to adapt to and incorporate. So at this point, we'll take another break and just see if there are any further questions that you have. And I think we have another question for you, which is, have any surveys like the GGS been fielded in your country? And Daniela, I think we're going to be opening up to further questions from the audience as well.
Yes, here I am again. Thank you so much, Tom. So let's go to the second part of our rounds of question and answers. Now all participants knows how it works, so I won't explain anything. We'll go direct to the questions. I was wondering, are there any data security issues if this data is to be transferred directly to NIDI from the interviewers?
So this is something we take very seriously. For those of you in Europe, we have new legislation coming into place in just 7 days. And this places a greater emphasis on data security and consent. So we now have a very robust framework in place that ensures that the data transferred to us is done so securely, and that we have best practices in place to handle that data and ensure that it is handled carefully, and that this data is only used for research purposes. We work with national teams, though, to adapt to the specific context of national data legislation, which, whilst standardized across Europe, are not entirely the same. So there is a significant amount of work that we need to do with national teams to ensure that we fit with national data protection laws. So this is why the data, the personal data that is included from the sample stays with the national team. So only the data from the survey responses themselves are those that are transferred to the Office of Committee.
I'll combine two questions. What the countries should do to be involved in the 2020 round, and is it necessary that initiatives comes from the official state institution?
Okay, so I'll answer one of those questions, and then I will ask for you to wait for the response to the other, as that's the final section of our presentations. The question that I will answer is that it is not at all necessary that the initiatives come from official institutions. It's entirely possible that it's the research community that takes the lead in starting the GGP in a country. As I said before, we actively encourage national teams to engage with official institutions where possible to gain the broadest support for the project and engage with stakeholders both in government, the National Statistical Offices, but also broader civil society. However, if the initiative comes from the academic community, that is still okay.
Okay, and in terms of themes, will the new GGP have some adapted questions in light of social changes?
Yes, good question. They will, but within certain boundary. What do I mean here is that obviously we want the core data to still be comparable to the previous way. This is very, very important for researchers in order to look at how things have changed. So what do I mean by that? The fertility history, the partnership history, some of the core variables. On the other hand, we're indeed aware of changes in society. So we're just about, in fact, to strike a task force on the questionnaire that will work really hard to try to make sure that it's fit to study, the questionnaire is fit to study these changes, but also the emerging issues in the scientific community. So this is something that we hope to deliver to our consortium board for approval later this year.
Okay. Data will be public available, microdata also, and when is it expected? If the data will be public available and when?
So this is a really simple and great question to answer because it's available now in some respects. The GGP 2020, as I mentioned, has already started in some countries, which we're kind of front runners in this. Belarus conducted theirs last year. That data is available. The microdata file is available to GGP users as of today. They can download that data and start conducting scientific research with it now. As countries deploy the survey, we will do our best to ensure that data will be available as soon after fieldwork as possible. And that will include all the microdata that we...
And what about excluding questions from the core questionnaire? Will this happen or keeping all questions?
So there are certain contexts in which some of the questions in the GGP, it is not appropriate to field. So for example, there's a question on whether you're in a registered partnership. And in some countries, registered partnerships simply don't exist. So in some countries, that question is not fielded. However, unlike in the previous round, we have a high degree of control over what questions are fielded. And unless there are real reasons for that question not to be fielded in a country, it will be asked within the survey. So there'll be a far greater compliance. However, we do adapt to national context. So if there are good reasons to exclude a question, we can. And this also accounts for adding questions. If there are good reasons to include additional questions to cover specific national issues, that can also be done in collaboration with the central hub.
Okay, is there a question on gender violence in the survey?
There certainly was none in the previous round. We're hesitant about that one. This is again something that the task force will have to evaluate. As I said, what we're certain at the moment, when it comes to the SDGs related to family planning, unmet needs, and that's as far as the sort of the executive decision has been taken. The other ones, the things that we are considering at the moment.
Okay, in terms of target participants, will you capture the age range at the share age? Will there be any oversamples of specific groups of interest, for example, minorities, complex families?
I will start with the end. What a very smart and clever question. Whoever asked that question must be very intelligent. The issue of capping the age range within share, in relation to share has been a hugely successful survey, and national governments have invested a huge amount of money in sampling the population over 50s. In countries where they have a share survey, we have now made it possible for countries, for GGP countries, to cap the age range at 49. So whilst the GGP is now still applicable for 18 to 79-year-olds, if there is an aging survey that is fielded in the country, we think it's perfectly reasonable for countries for which this is the case to field the survey only for those aged 18 to 49. And this makes perfect sense. In terms of oversampling for particular groups, minorities or complex families, this is obviously a very nice research design, and it's something that we would work with national teams to develop in specific contexts. However, we don't have a blanket policy for across the GGP because obviously each national context requires a different oversampling strategy. So, for example, in the previous round, there was an oversample of Turkish migrants in the German sample because of the particular context of Germany. And we'll be looking to support those kind of oversampling efforts or targeted efforts within particular national teams. Okay,
I'll take a final one for this block, and then we'll continue with Deirdre, and then you can see how far you can go with the extra questions. So in the case of initiatives do not come from official statistical offices, will the teams be responsible for funding the implementation of GGP in the countries, or is there any kind of centralized funding to support national teams in these cases?
So obviously funding is a key issue in setting up any kind of research project on this kind of scale. Now, obviously the funding has to come from somewhere. Sometimes that has to be from the national offices, and we can support national teams in approaching national funding agencies. However, the possibility of national funding agencies supporting fieldwork in certain countries is highly limited, given the cost of fieldwork and the restrictions placed on research budgets at the moment. In such circumstances, what we can do is bring national teams together to work on joint proposals for international level calls for funding. And this is something that we're looking to support at the moment. However, for us to do this, we need to know in which countries there is interest and which kind of communities would like to field the GGP. That's why it's really vital that after today's webinar, you get in touch with us and you make sure that we understand who is interested and willing and participating in the GGP in your country. If you don't let us know, then when a funding call does come up at the international level, where coordination might be required, we won't be able to contact you and we won't be able to reach out to you. So it's imperative that you keep us up to date with the situation in your country.
Okay, just a final question, just a clarification regarding the sampling of different age groups. So does this mean that the GGP will contain very little information about gender issues of 49 plus years old?
Not at all. So in some, as I mentioned, in some countries where there is an aging survey, they won't be including respondents over the age of 50. However, this doesn't actually cover all countries in the GGP. One thing I mentioned earlier that is in Latin America and East Asia, there is increasing interest in the GGP, and it's likely that a number of the countries will be participating. In these countries, those populations will be covered. And we'll be also working with SHARE to discuss how our questionnaires can be aligned going forward as well. And this is something that we've already started through the European project called CERIS.
Maybe just to clarify that a bit further, the GGP continues to be a survey from 18 till 79. What we're mentioning here is that in countries where they are particularly rich in having data on the older population, we're very aware that maybe there's no need to overlap and to do twice the field work for these ages. So what we're looking here would be in each country to discuss the situation, see if we can align with the other survey that does the aging population. But ultimately, it's still our aim to cover the whole age group. We're just mentioning it. That is one possible flexibility in some specific circumstances, situation.
Okay, so I'll leave you again and let Deirdre present her final part, or?
frequently asked questions. Okay, so before we move on to the final part of the presentation, we've just got some frequently asked questions that might help clarify some of the issues that have already been raised in the questions that you've fielded. So one of the key ones is, when is the fieldwork window? So the fieldwork window will be from January 2020 and through to December, sorry, it said 2022, it should be December 2021, which is a two-year fieldwork window. So this means that countries can start at slightly different times and allows it a higher degree of flexibility in when the survey is fielded. So if you're not able to start on January the 1st, 2020, there is still time to participate, and you shouldn't necessarily feel too despondent about your ability to participate. So the second question that I wanted to also cover is, what is the target sample, which is an issue we just touched on. So as Anne said, the GGP remains a survey of 18 to 79-year-olds. But obviously, with the increasing prevalence of shared data and the restrictions on research budgets in several countries, we're realistic that in some countries it might make better sense to restrict the sample to 18 to 49. But we'll work with national teams to ensure, and in which case the sample can be restricted to 5,000 respondents from the normal 10,000 that we require within the GGP. So, but we will work with national teams to come up with a strategy that best fits their national context, and that's the main point. So another crucial question, we touched on some funding questions earlier, is how much does it cost to run the GGP? This is a really difficult question to answer because it varies hugely across countries. The overall fieldwork costs can range from as little as 60,000 in some countries, right up to 1.2 million euros. This is obviously a huge range, and it depends on not just the cost of living in a particular country and the cost of fieldwork, but also how the fieldwork is conducted and the particular strategy taken. So whether it's a reduced sample, whether there's oversampling of particular groups, as we've already mentioned, and what particular mode is going to be used for the fieldwork. But we can work with you based on our experience with various countries in diverse range of situations to produce the best possible estimates that can ensure the best possible funding strategy for your national context. A further question is, what are the sampling requirements? Someone mentioned earlier whether it was a requirement that the National Statistical Office was involved. It's not a requirement, but something we highly support. The only requirement on sampling is that it's a random probability sample. However, obviously the population registers in many countries represent the best possible sample, and we strongly encourage researchers in those countries to work with the National Statistical Office. If this isn't possible for whatever reason, then we'll work with the national teams to ensure that the data collected is the best possible. So just to summarize the takeaway messages from this part of the presentation, we'll be looking to significantly improve data quality in the new GGP data collection model. We'll be raising the technical sophistication of this data collection, increasing methodological standardization and transparency. This will hopefully reduce costs and reduce resources required to field the survey, and also reduce the burden on national teams who are wanting to support data collection in their country. And it will also reduce the time between data collection and publication, supporting responsive science that can support policy decision making. So the early indications we have from the fieldwork we've been conducting so far is it lowers costs, it increases the quality of the data, and it produces that data quicker. So these are all great positive signs for the future of the project. So I'll now pass over to Deirdre for the final section of our presentation.
Good afternoon, and I'd like to start with the poll. So it would be very interesting to us to know who's joining us and from what type of organization you are, so that we have a sense of who's interested in hearing about GGP and perhaps getting involved and fielding the survey in your country. So this next part of the survey, of the presentation, will address exactly that. If what you've heard today has inspired you to get involved or to follow us, to potentially field the survey in your country, then this section will tell you a bit more of how that can happen, how you can pursue that. So to follow us. there are a few options. We're present on various channels of social media, and our website is available 24/7. If you're not already following us on Twitter or haven't found our Facebook page, please do go and do so. We're also extremely contactable via email. So if ever in doubt, just drop us a line. We're monitoring our inbox on an ongoing basis. Our newsletters are produced every bi-monthly basis, and that's a great way to see examples of how data can be used for cross-national comparative purposes, what recent publications users of our data have published in peer-reviewed journals and elsewhere, and key upcoming events, either where you might meet us, where you would have the chance to hear research presented based on GGP data sets, or to hear about some of the innovations that are being implemented. If you'd like to meet in person, well, we will be at the European Population Conference at the start of June. And as Tom already mentioned, we'll have a presence at the Asian Population Association Conference in Shanghai in July. And we have the regional conferences in Puebla, Mexico in October, in Zagreb, and in Scandinavia in Stockholm. If you have the need for promotional materials, if you want to start an outreach and engagement strategy in order to build momentum and start getting attention from either potential funders, policymakers who could have an interest in having a national data set based on the GGP survey, then we can also provide you with promotional materials that you're free to translate into national, local languages. We can help you think about the positioning and ways to communicate using the existing materials that we have. You just have to drop us a line at our email address. Am I overlooking anything? We have a user conference at the end of 2019 that will be hosted and held at INED in Paris. So that's another great opportunity to come and to interact with not only us as a team, but the wider community that used the data sets to generate these, I'm going to quote Tom, responsive science to support policy decision making. So to join GGP, there are a few steps involved, but essentially it's important to make your interest known and make it known to us via email, via telephone call, via smoke signals, whatever works for you to reach out to us. We'd like to know so that we can follow you and support you in the process. We may already have national contacts with whom it makes sense to be in touch. We also are working to track what our potential funding and research national roadmaps for funding for research, so we can give you tips about where to get more information on those aspects. Forming a national team that has representatives from research and academia, from policymaking, from your statistical agency. We've found that these are strong consortia for fielding the surveys, so we would encourage that. And then working together to organize a funding strategy. That's really what we can offer to help you on getting on your way. And then our last bit of information is actually when it comes to running the GGP. We will be involved in the discussions and the strategy and the planning around running it in your country from the outset, talking about fieldwork and data collection options, funding strategies, how we can further help you to realize the survey. So in-depth discussions with you about some of the diversity and specific needs that have already been mentioned, and going back and forth to figure out what are the best suited plans for your context. So that's really what I wanted to convey. It's first things first, get in touch with us. Let us know that your interest is there so that we can be there and support you and start this conversation if we're not already on the way together.
Okay, so I think this is for one last Q&A time for any remaining questions. Is that right, Daniela?
Final round of questions. Let's see. There you can see that there's some movement here. So what's the main role of the national coordination team?
So the national coordination team helps adapt the GGP to the national context and actually field the question, the survey in the country. So whilst the GGP Central Office can provide a lot of the information and the resources necessary to field the survey, there are some things that we require help with in applying it in particular national context. First of all, we need help in finding funding and supporting national teams in finding that funding to field the survey within a country. We also need help in translating and adapting the questionnaire to the specific national context, both in terms of linguistically, in ensuring that it fits linguistically with the survey, but also to ensure that it fits the national context in answering specific questions that the research community in that country has. So that they're still heavily involved, but what we've been trying to do is reduce the burden on national teams from a technical perspective in overseeing the fieldwork and some of the more kind of technical elements of fielding the survey.
Maybe I can add to that the key role of the national team is obviously to form a consortium, and as we've been saying today, it's highly recommended to have academics on board, but people from the government, the statistical office, some stakeholders also. And why? I think you need, before to have a successful fieldwork, you need often to raise awareness about the survey. We've now been working with various countries that have done really nice work in raising this awareness to the population that this is what's going to happen. And there's importance to feel to the country that it's providing them some answer, that they give something back. So in some of the countries, a few months ago, we were, for example, in Belarus for a superb seminar that was really showcasing what have we learned through this data and engaging with stakeholders, with policymakers. So that there's no way we can do it on our own. We entirely rely on the national coordination team for that. So in addition to obviously helping for them to do the field work, but when it comes to these additional events and activities surrounding the GGP, the national team is essential.
Okay, are the only costs for each country the sample design costs and the collection costs?
So that's a very good question. It kind of builds on Anne's response there. Each country is different. In some countries, actually, there are additional costs in that the additional dissemination and engagement with the community are required, and therefore we suggest that budgets do include additional dissemination work or support for the national community. And each country is different, so there could be additional costs that are required. Also, sometimes the coordination, whilst we can provide a lot of support, things like translation issues or in actually acquiring the sample can be a substantial amount of work in themselves, and so funding for those kind of issues can still be required in particular circumstances. However, the core costs for each national data collection are the sample design costs and the data collection costs. We provide far more now from the central office in terms of the questionnaire coding, testing, pre-testing, data processing, archiving costs. All these are now met by NIDI.
Okay, if a country doubles or triples the sample size, will you still handle the additional processing? Would there be an additional cost to the country?
No.
No for the two questions?
No, there's no. So if you field a sample of 20,000 as opposed to 10,000, that will be the same kind of level of support and resources from the GGP.
Okay, so we can handle all the if countries are able to double or triple the sample size, you still handle it.
Yeah, the only exception to that might be we mentioned oversampling of particular subpopulations earlier. And if that oversampling included additional modules that needed to be processed and handled by the central team, that might be a different issue if it's not focused purely on the core questionnaire. But if it's just an extension of the core questionnaire, the sample receiving the core questionnaire, then there are no additional costs. No.
Okay, so I think we are done here with questions. I would like to thank you, Anne, Tom, and Deirdre for the wonderful presentation. Thank all participants for joining us today. I would like to thank my team here at Population Europe for all the preparation for this webinar. I'm answering the final question here. If you can send out the PowerPoint, yes, we'll send out the PowerPoint and a bit some other informations about the materials from GGP and the results of this webinar. And stay tuned. We all have our Twitter accounts, Population Europe and GGP. And signing for the new newsletter of GGP at their website. Population Europe has the links in the website for you to sign up to our newsletter. And I hope we can talk more deeply in the future with the GGP team and develop new surveys around the world. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you to my team providing support here and doing a great job. And thank you for Population Europe for making that possible. Greatly appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Bye-bye.